it's not just China that thinks this isn't necessarily a good idea. You can argue, I think, quite persuasively that as China rises, the countries of the West are walking, perhaps even sleepwalking, into a new Cold War. Aukus was announced, to everyone's surprise, towards the end of 2021, about 2.5 years ago. And at the time, everyone understood it to be about making nuclear powered, conventionally armed submarines for Australia. So AUKUS, of course, is Australia, UK, US. And the idea is they were going to provide these submarines, which would be something very new, a big step for Australia. And no one was really aware, and even when you scrutinize the small print, it's not very obvious that there is a second element to AUKUS, and that is to develop more broadly high-tech weapons technology, including hypersonic missiles, underwater drones, cyber technology, quantum technologies. And to do these in partnership with other countries. So you've got the central three, Australia, UK, and the US. But a few weeks ago, there came the prospect of AUKUS, because the Americans were talking to Japan about joining the second element of AUKUS, not the nuclear submarine, but the technology part. And today, we may be looking at SCAUKUS, or perhaps if Japan's also a member, SCAJAUKUS, because South Korea has been in talks with the three original members about joining what's called Pillar 2, the second initiative in this grouping to jointly develop this very expensive and very sophisticated technology. And the answer to the question of how China is taking it, China has taken it quite badly from the beginning. They say that it is a stealthy means of encircling China, suppressing its ambitions to become a regional and a global power, and a kind of seed for a future Asian NATO, if you like. And the fact that the original three, it seems, are going to be joined by more, will only strengthen that conviction on the part of China and China's supporters that this is not just about building one weapons platform for Australia, that it's intended to develop into something broader and something bigger.
Is this sort of all a surprise? I mean, it I guess it seems like the sort of thing that you might have anticipated, or that China might have anticipated. But from the outside looking in, did we ever anticipate that it would include, what did you call it, Skajorkus, this ridiculous name that we're coming up with now, that South Korea and Japan and others might be tempted?
I was looking today at the original announcement, and no, it wasn't obvious then at all. It was presented very much as a trilateral three-way deal. And I think the reason, I suspect, this is just my interpretation, that all along they intended to bring other people in. But they knew that if they announced that at the outset, then China would be even more angry and affronted and defensive than it already was. And also that it would cause doubts among people who otherwise are kind of broadly supportive of the US Western alliance. It's not just China that thinks this isn't necessarily a good idea. You can argue, I think, quite persuasively that as China rises, the countries of the West are walking, perhaps even sleepwalking, into a new Cold War with an arms race, with two heavily armed blocs aligned, with one or other of the great powers. And that this is really a very bad idea. I mean, we lived through that in the 20th century, the second half of it. Do we have to do it again? Isn't there a better way of facing China, of standing up to them on human rights and political rights, without just reverting to that same old Cold War model that endured for so long with the Soviet Union?
It feels like a very provocative move. Is it certain that South Korea and Japan will get involved in this sort of second pillar 2, I think they're calling it, aren't they, of AUKUS now? Is this decided?
No, it's not finally decided. No, announcement has been made, but the fact that they're openly talking about it suggests, I believe, that both sides want it to happen. I mean, these projects they're talking about are highly technical. You're talking about developing quantum technology and hypersonic weapons. So there'll be a lot of, I's to be dotted and T's to be crossed before anything can be, fully announced and go ahead. But I don't have much doubt that it will go ahead eventually in some form or other.
How much more power would this give South Korea and Japan within the region, quite apart from the support of these sort of three giant nations that already form AUKUS? Could either of those two nations have built the sort of weaponry you're talking about solo without that support potentially, or is it, or would it just have taken them so long, almost maybe not worth it?
No, I don't think it's so much about South Korea and Japan, arming themselves and building up their own military capabilities. Both of them are US treaty allies, which means that if either are attacked, the United States has an obligation to defend both of them with all its might, and that might is considerable, as we know. And you have to be clear. I mean, AUKUS is not a treaty alliance. It's not NATO. It's about these military technical matters, this military scientific development at the moment. But you can easily imagine that as things are going, that it might solidify into something else and something different and something more like a defence treaty, like NATO in the future. But we're a good way from that happening just yet.
In terms of the other nations that might sort of feel threatened by this, I'm imagining there's likely to be some sort of reaction from North Korea as well, would there?
Yeah, North Korea always has something to say about things like this. I mean, Kim Jong Un a few months ago, explicitly said this is the emergence of an Asian version of NATO, the root cause of war and aggression. That's not surprising. Otherwise, it's I mean, China's got its sort of followers and its supporters. Countries like Cambodia. There are plenty of smaller countries in the region who are far from being supporters and allies and camp followers of China, who are very uneasy about this. I mean, to give you an idea, last year I interviewed two prime ministers, the Prime Minister of Mongolia and the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea. And those two countries are about as unlike one another as you can imagine in almost every way, in terms of their geographical position, their climate, their economies, and so on, their geostrategic orientation. But both of those leaders said basically the same thing. They said, please don't make us choose between the US and China in a new superpower confrontation. Because I think they remember that, although the Cold War is remembered by some people now as a victory of the free world over international communism, the US and its allies over the Soviet Union. Before that happened, there were an awful lot of casualties, and the countries that suffered most were the sort of smaller, medium-sized countries. Many of them ended up with Cold War dictators, right-wing and American-leaning, as well as socialist and Soviet-leaning, who suppressed human rights, who brought great hardship for those people. So, the countries in East Asia, Southeast Asia, countries like Malaysia, even Singapore, really don't want this competition to heat up into another Cold War because it won't work to their advantage at all, they believe. To go back to the question of is this something provocative? I mean, of course, what the the countries of Aukus and many other countries say is, look, it's not us that are being provocative, it's China. China is being extremely, the polite word is assertive, you might say aggressive or even belligerent in its actions in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, claiming islands that are administered by Japan, and especially over Taiwan, the independent self-ruling island that China claims as its own and reserves the right to invade if necessary in order to reunify it with the mainland.
And I just have one final question relating to the timing of this. You and I have spoken in the past about the situation involving Taiwan. I wonder whether there's any sort of link with that sort of increasingly uncertain situation.
Yeah, I mean, it's all part and parcel of the same emerging atmosphere of confrontation. Taiwan is at the center of it, no doubt. That's got to be the biggest flashpoint. But that has been developing for several years now. China, for example, has been flying its planes, sailing its military ships closer and closer to Taiwan. So I don't think that this development with South Korea and Japan is precisely timed to meet any particular development, but it's part of a sense that the security of the region is all heading in one direction.